Welcome everybody to our discussion panel on digital identity. I want to invite the rest of the panelists up while I'm talking. We've got a really short time together to cover a lot of information on digital identity and payments. So let's jump in right now with some brief introductions. I'm Estrada, and I work with Stripe, where I am the head of industry standards and regulatory engagement.
I'm Juliana Cafik, and I'm a principal program manager for identity standards at Microsoft.
Hello, everyone. I am Atul Prasad. I'm a director of product management at Qualcomm. I manage the retail and payments product line, meaning hardware and software that goes into payment terminals, point-of-sale machines, and things like that.
I'm Megan Shamas. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for the FIDO Alliance, which means my remit is globally education awareness around FIDO authentication and passkeys.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. If we took a survey of the room today to write out the definition of identity, I'm sure that we'd come up with at least a dozen different ideas. So before we get started, I'd like to center us just a bit and focus on the world of payments, where identity is usually discussed in the sense of authentication. That is, the process of verifying identity, and within our industry, that's usually either accessing a CDE or cardholder data environment, or the ability to actually initiate a payment transaction. So those two areas are what we want to talk through with you all today, in the hopes that we spark further discussion on how advances in identity and authentication technologies can impact PCI standards and payments in general. So first off, Megan, if we can start with you. I think this is one of the first times that FIDO has attended a PCI community meeting, so welcome.
Well, thank you for finally allowing me to be here.
So there's been a lot of movement in the last few years in the authentication space. FIDO might not be a household name among this community, but for lots of folks here in the room, if you've got a physical security key on your laptop, or heard the term passkey when you're shopping online, both of those are founded on super important FIDO standards. So Megan, can you help us kind of set the stage as to what's happening in this space?
Oh, wow, yeah. So it all started in 1950 something. No, I'm just kidding. But no, the way I want to address this answer is by looking a little bit at the authentication ecosystem. And I promise I will not take the entire time of this panel explaining this, but so where have we been, right? So usernames and passwords. So how many people know what the biggest security issue is on the web in terms of account takeovers? Shout out the answer. Okay, it's phishing, right? I heard it. I heard someone shout out the answer. You didn't know you were going to be part of this, but guess what? You are. So it's phishing. And the reason for that is because we rely on usernames and passwords to access our online accounts. And when the online account was created, whatever that was, a password, it wasn't contemplated we would have 200 online accounts, right? So we're accessing these accounts with usernames and passwords, maybe your work accounts, maybe your consumer accounts, whatever. And the issue is that it's a shared secret, right? The service provider needs to know it, you need to know it, and frankly, using the same one for numerous accounts is a very common thing because it's kind of burdensome to do anything more than that, or to meet the requirements of password hygiene. And so, over time, we've sort of built extra layers on top of this fundamentally flawed first factor, which is the password. So you've got SMS OTPs, which are very common, which are also phishable, and you've got sort of band-aids on top of this password. And so what FIDO Alliance's mission is actually to get rid of the password. That is what our mission is. And we're doing that through passkeys. And how many people feel like they have a grasp on what a passkey even is, besides Tim Capali? Okay. Wow. Okay. So a passkey is a replacement for the fundamentally flawed first factor, the password. It's based on public key cryptography, whereby there is no shared secrets. There's no secret that is shared with the online service in order to authenticate the user. It's a private key. The public key resides with the online service. the key exchange, and you can sign in. But what's great about it is that you can sign in using however you unlock your device, PC, whatever. With passkeys, you can access those online accounts across all of your services through what you would typically consider like a password manager experience. Or you can have what we call device-bound passkeys, which are bound to a device. So yeah, long-winded way of saying we are replacing passwords with something that is fundamentally more secure. Phishing-resistant authentication, if you've heard of that, if you've heard people say that, they're talking about FIDO. We're talking about passkeys, period. And so we're replacing that fundamentally flawed first factor with something that's much better than that. And I would love to let other people speak, so I will leave it at that. But what I will say is like, this is a revolution in how we look at authentication.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, just a kind of personal anecdote, who in this room serves as tech support for their family and friends? Yeah, that's what I thought. So in terms of like passwords, authentication, I came up with this new metric called the mother-in-law metric, and it was, does my mother-in-law understand the technology that's going on? And like about 6 months ago, she actually phoned us up and said to me literally, what password manager should I use? And I about lost it, that like it actually became mainstream. So that's something just to kind of think about is like, while we're talking a lot about advanced authentication and different factors and things like that, those are the types of end users that are really at the ultimate adoption. So thank you, Megan. Atul, I wanted to pass it on to you next. Great to see you here. Great to see Qualcomm as a participating organization. Most folks in the room might not be familiar with all the things that Qualcomm does, but likely have a device in their pocket or some sort of electronic device nearby that has something built by Qualcomm. So when we think about identity and authentication, there's a whole host of data out there. Can you talk a bit about what Qualcomm sees in terms of these core technologies?
Sure. Well, by the way, I just came out of a tech support session with my mother-in-law half an hour ago, so that's very apt. But in terms of core technologies, I would like to say that the core principles on which these technologies are built remain the same, that of security and integrity of data. Now, for payments, we're using a lot more data other than what you provide, like in terms of, let's say, using passkeys or credit cards. There is additional peripheral data that is available that can be utilized to authenticate. And so I think what is important in terms of this core technologies is how do we protect that data, and how the evolution of this data sharing happens, because some of this data that we're going to be using for payments, for example, biometrics, is also going to be used for other purposes.
That's quite a lot to think about. So we're essentially generating data all the time, whether or not we know it. Even being in this conference center with our devices connecting to Wi-Fi and others, that could be both for good and for bad purposes. Megan and then Juliana, of course. I want to get back to you on this from FIDO's perspective. What are your thoughts on how identity and authentication standards are impacted, and any insight that you can share with FIDO or with us, how FIDO is looking at this from sort of a privacy and interoperability perspective?
Yeah, of course. So, so to be clear, FIDO is a standard, open standard for authentication. So the authentication event is not enrollment. It's not the other pieces of an account lifecycle. When we talk about account lifecycles, I mean whether it's people within your work, within your own accounts, with your online services, but from like a PCI or workplace perspective, I mean like how are you onboarding your employees and allowing them access to authenticate to one of your services or one of their apps that they need to. So the FIDO standard specifically addresses the authentication piece, but the onboarding of that person and giving them the privileges to access those services is vitally important to the integrity of the entire life cycle of the account. And so the way that we look at this, and from a standards perspective, we look at, we certify remote onboarding and even in-person onboarding processes so that the integrity of that user is set from the beginning of their onboarding into your system so that you can give them access to authenticate to services. So our perspective on the entire life cycle is that you don't want to miss any of these pieces, particularly this onboarding piece. And so how you're identifying folks and onboarding them into the environment, I think is actually the most critical part of the process.
Cool. Thanks for that. Okay, let's kind of pivot just a little bit to the data security standard, and kind of more core into how identity and authentication is represented within PCI's suite of standards. So Juliana, I'd like to go to you next, if you wouldn't mind. Could you share a bit about your thoughts on PCI's standards in general and the approach to identity and authentication today? Because many folks in this room are either directly implementing identity management solutions or a part of the assessor community that is looking at the efficacy of identity systems. Could you help walk us through what's currently in the standards, how identity authentication is approached, and kind of how you see that matching up with the technology of today?
Sure. First, though, I have to defend the mother-in-laws out there. Being one myself, I will never call you for tech support. So PCI, the standards, authentication, identity, that's massive. This is a massive conversation. So I'm going to try and narrow the context in which I answer your question. So first and foremost, the first thing is we have to understand the PCI standards themselves and where and why they apply, and what the benefits they are to provide to in Microsoft's terms, to our customers, in your terms, to your customers and stakeholders. And so it's a very complex environment to be able to try and unpack and unravel. The first piece is, and I can take you on a journey of what opened my eyes in the context of PCI DSS and its applications, is drilling down into the individual security controls and applying your specific or the environment's specific capabilities today and determining what and how you can configure your environment, whether it's on-prem, whether it's cloud, whether it's a hybrid, whether you have multiple service providers that are in scope for PCI that are provisioning services to you. You must drill down into each control within the standard and determine how that control can be met within your own environment or with the environment of your suppliers or with on-prem. So that's the key place. The next piece is to understand how you actually meet those controls and where you have to provide compensating controls to overcome variances or gaps. That's basically the foundation for implementing based on the standard. And the challenge we face now is the standards for authentication, for identity verification, for roles-based account access are changing based on the attack vectors we're seeing and the security challenges we're seeing. We saw Ashok and Brad talk to how clouds can start to overcome some of those. Those are not covered off in the standard today. So how do we start to apply and accelerate our ability to mitigate the attacks and while still meeting the standards requirements?
Excellent, thank you. And when you mention that, Juliana, there's a whole host of other industry standards out there that go very, very deep into identity and authentication and the core technologies. If we could maybe just an open question for everybody here on the panel, if there's other sorts of standards that are out there that folks should be paying attention to, where can they kind of go get educated on what's happening and what's coming?
Okay, I'll jump first.
Yeah.
The world of standards is evolving at a really rapid pace all over the world. And we're also seeing the emergence of legalized trust frameworks that address and identify specific standards, particularly with respect to identity all over the world. And they are very specific. This starts to get confusing or a little bit blurred in the context of PCI, where we have individual identity employee who, and that individual, to steal someone's tagline from earlier, can choose their own adventure today. I'm an employee, I'm a parent, I am renting a car, I'm a traveler, I am a consumer, I am me, but that the identity standards need to be able to address every need I have for every circumstance I am going to interact with you online or face-to-face using cryptographic means. So that means that the standards for identity will intersect. At some point, they will start to converge with payment. We see it in the context of age verification using mobile driver's licenses for strong identity verification going to be coincidentally presented on a mobile device to purchase alcohol or to rent a car, so that we're going to start to see convergence at the consumer level that will intersect with PCI DSS CDE scope. And so we have to start to look at the standards together and understand how they can complement each other rather than be divergent and challenging to adopt both sets of standards that are one regulated, the other legally, in the context of trust frameworks, legally required. So we have to start to bridge them together and understand how they can complement and support each other to ensure a strong and secure and easy to use or good solid user experience, blending both sets and contemplating both sets of standards.
Yeah, I'd like to touch upon two key trends, right? Building upon what Juliana just said, especially several alliances like FIDO have done a great job in standardizing protocols and implementations around biometrics, but they have mostly been adopted on consumer devices, like how do you log into your laptop or how do you unlock your phone. But when these are going to be used on merchant devices, the data flows are going to be completely different. So everybody in this room is a participant in one of that processes, and so one has to be mindful of this change that is going to come about. And then the other trend is the evolution of the MPOC standard, which is accepting payments on consumer devices. Now, the thing to look at there is that it is not a purpose-built device, right? All of the payment-related standards or security standards have mostly been built for devices which were purpose-built. But if you bring in consumer devices into the mix, how do you assure the same level of system integrity and security, et cetera? So those are a couple of things that I think we should be mindful about.
Excellent. And yeah, I'm sensing a couple of common themes here of the examples that you both provided. Renting a car, purchasing something, using a mobile phone. I think everybody would probably raise their hands if I asked the question, who got on an airplane to get here, who rented a car, who presented their ID at the hotel. These are all things that are part of the industry in which we work, but it also impacts us as consumers. And for me at Stripe, identity and authentication in my mind is built on trust. And so if we look at the way that transactions happen today, either by presenting a payment card in person or manually entering a payment card online, all the different kind of interactions, at its core, it's really an interaction between a person and a seller or a merchant. There's so many expectations within that type of interaction. So my mental model for payments is that it's ceremonial, to be quite honest, like across cultures and things. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how to honor those types of traditions across geographies and with technology and sort of make it all interoperable. And I know that's a really, really tall task, but I just wanted to share that because it means a lot to me personally that this stuff works. So I wanted to, last question for the group, and we've got pretty limited time, but I know we're all here working to make the payments industry better, more secure, and recognize that we've got this broader impact. If there's maybe some closing thoughts, we can go kind of round robin here on what would you like to leave the group here with?
My call to action would be to start the identity standards community starting to work directly with the PCI standards community so that we can start to proactively align these standards to support common, secure user journeys, no matter what interaction they choose.
I think for me, for everybody, I think we have to be mindful of the consumer, their data, and their rights to privacy.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those things. What I really would love to see, and we do see some of this in the wild, and PCI is one organization. There's other regulatory bodies, policy setters, folks that build out requirements to work with us. Folks that are setting standards for authentication or identity or whatever it is to ensure that the guidance, the requirements they're setting, and then the guidance that they follow up with is representative of like where the tech has evolved, right? And so I think PCI has been actually great at recognizing, okay, there are qualities of phishing-resistant authentication that are just unlike what we've done like forever, right? Your historical way of thinking about like MFA is no longer really, we've kind of flipped all of that on its head. And you see organizations like NIST, for example, who has, very much embraced providing guidance to folks around how to deal with phishing-resistant authentication, how to deal with FIDO, and how to think about it. And there's a lot of work to be done, to be clear, but, my CTA is like, let us work with you all to evolve these requirements so that they're representative. And that you all have like really clear guidance of like how to implement this, because I feel the pain when it's like I don't quite know if I'm complying or not with this, and make it more transparent. Does this work? So that's my summation.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time today, and hopefully this sparks further discussion amongst us. And we're holding up everybody for lunch, so we're done. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.